Hello and welcome to the second part on how to make a game like Clash of Clans. So in the previous videos we set up the server and the client. Now let me open these two projects. First of all, I'm gonna open the Unity project, which is our client, and the second I am going to open the server, which is a C# console application. Now server and the client are open. In the client, I am going to switch the build platform to Android. Now in the player settings, I am going to change the company name and the product name. Also, I'm going to change the device orientation. And in the other settings, I will go to scripting backend and I choose IL2CPP, and I also target ARM64 devices. So that's it for setting up the client for Android devices. Now let me close this and go to the server. Let's go to the terminal script, and here on the data I am just going to remove this example codes. Now I am going to where my XAMPP is installed, and I'm going to start the MySQL service. Now let's open the MySQL admin, and I'm going to databases and create a new database. Now we've successfully created a new database. I'm just gonna copy the name of this database. And let's go back to the server and open the database script. Here in the MySQL server, I'm just gonna leave that number because I am using the local device, and that is the IP address of the local server. The username is usually root by default, the password is empty by default, and the database name is the name we've just created. Of course, it is wise to change the username and password, but I'm just gonna leave it as the default value because we're still developing the game and we're not publishing it yet. But once we publish the game, maybe then we'll change these credentials and add more security to our server. So now the database script has been set up. The terminal also has been cleared from all the examples. Let's actually go to the client and clear the examples here as well. I'm just going to create a new folder called scripts. And here in the scenes folder, I'm just going to delete the example scene and create a brand new scene. And I'm just going to name it game. Let's open this scene. Here in the scripts, I will create a new script called player. And here, let's create an empty game object with the same name and attach this script to this game object. Now we have an instance of the player in our scene. I'm also going to rename this to light and this one to camera. Let's save the scene and open this script. Now in the player script, we're gonna handle the majority of the game functions. So let's clear this, and I usually give my scripts a namespace, but you don't have to do that. So when your scene gets loaded, you have an instance of the player in your scene, which means the awake function, and after that the start function is going to be called. Let's go and create the start function, and you want to go and say using developers hub dot realtime networking dot client. So the second game starts, you want to attempt to connect to the server. So for that we're going to say realtime networking dot, and we say connect. With this line of code, you will attempt to connect to the server, but you also need to listen for the response of this request. So before we call this, we also going to add a listener. So we're saying real-time networking on connecting to server result plus equals to, and we need to create a function for this. Let's actually go here and say private void connection response. And here we say connection response. But as you can see, we are getting an error. It's because this connection response needs to get a boolean. And we also need to get rid of the parentheses. So here it is. First, we are going to start listening, and after that, we are trying to connect to the server, and the result of that attempt will be passed down here in this function. So we say if the connection was successful, we're gonna do something, and let's remove the extra L. And if it wasn't successful, we're going to do something else. And now, if the connection was successful, then that is good. We're gonna do whatever it is, but before we go into that, let's say the connection was a failure. What happens if we failed to connect the server? In that case, we're gonna pop up a message box, which says failed to connect to the server, okay? And there is a button on it that says try again. When somebody hits the try again, this method that we're about to create will be called private void retry connect to server. So actually, let's make this public because we're probably going to assign a button to this. Well, actually, let's just rename this to connect to server, and instead of doing this in the start, I'm just gonna cut this and put it here. And instead of doing that, we're just going to call this function in the start method. So whenever a start method is getting called, this connect to server will be called, and first it start listening for a connection result, then it will try to connect to the server. Of course, the response will be passed here, and once we receive the response, let me copy this and paste it here. We're just going to remove the listener by saying minus equals connection response. So here in the else, let's say to do connection failed message box with retry button. So whenever this retry button gets pressed, this is going to be called one more time, and this cycle keeps going and keeps going until a successful connection. So we're gonna handle that later. We're just assuming that the connection is going to be successful right now. So once the connection was successful, then we need to make sure we are listening to know whenever we get disconnected from the server. So there is a function for that on disconnected from server. So once the connection was successful, we are going to start listening on this plus equals to, and let's just create a method for it. So let's assign this function to our disconnection event. So that's that. Let's actually remove the listener once this disconnection happened. And we're just going to remove the listener from here. And we're gonna do the same thing here as well. Once we are in the middle of the game, for example, and suddenly we get disconnected, again, we're gonna pop up a message saying you got disconnected, and with a retry button which the user presses, and it will attempt to reconnect to the game. So we're gonna handle those later. For now, as I said, we're gonna assume the connection is successful and it is not going to be disconnected in the middle of the game. But even if those scenarios happen, we got them handled. Of course, we're gonna handle them later, but we have created the foundation for them and we're gonna build on them later. Is actually connected to the server. It means that our client can send and receive data. So the first thing we're gonna check the player's account to see if there is an account for this player, so this player can log in. If you played the Clash of Clans or any other mobile online games, usually these games don't ask for a username and password. Once you open the game, a new account has been generated for you and they don't bother you with all that username, password, email and stuff like that. They're gonna provide you an option in the settings to sync your device with a Google or Facebook or anything to save your account. And we're gonna do exactly the same thing. We're not gonna ask for username, password and all that stuff. We're just gonna generate a new account. First of all, we're gonna check to see if there is an account previously been generated for this device. If there is not, then we're gonna create a new account for it. I don't know if you know this or not, but there is this value you can access in Unity called device unique identifier. Let's go to system info and say device unique identifier. It's a unique device identifier. It is guaranteed to be unique for every device. So we're just going to store this as a string, saying string device. So this is our device ID, and in the sender, whenever you want to send a message to the server, you use sender and you just simply say send, and we're going to use TCP for all our requests. Do not use UDP because it's not reliable. We're gonna say TCP send and we're going to assign an ID for this request. So on the server side, we will know that this is a request for authentication. So we're gonna say the request for authentication, let's say it's number 1, and the value we're going to be sending is device. So we're gonna be sending a string with the ID of 1. We can actually create an enum to identify our packages. Let's actually do that. I'm just going to create an enum called requests ID, and the ID of 1, I'm going to assign it to auth. Let's go to our request, and here in the center, I'm just going to say request ID dot auth, and I'm going to cast this as an integer, which means it is going to get the integer value assigned to this variable. Of course, you don't have to do this. You can just pass 1. The only reason I'm doing this is to not get confused. So later on, I could just look at the request IDs and know which request ID is for what. That's the only reason. You don't have to do this. You can just... So here, on a successful connection, the first thing we do, we're going to pass the device ID to the server to see if there is an account for this device. Okay, now that we have sent this, let's go to the server and receive this. I'm going to open the server, and here on the terminal, we're going to the data region. And if you remember, the package we sent was in a string. So here on the received string, it is going to be passed to us. So I'm just going to create a switch statement, and I'm going to switch between packet IDs. This packet ID is 1, the one we assigned to authentication. So I'm gonna just say packet ID, and in the case of value 1, we'll know that this is a request for authentication. A client, which is this client ID, has sent a request to the server to be authenticated, and this data here is the device ID. So how we're gonna process that? Of course, we're gonna need to connect to the database and search the values. So let's go to the database. As you can see, there is a bunch of values by default here that can help you set up a successful connection to the database. So there are 2 methods. And here I'm just gonna use the second method. It is a select statement. So I'm just gonna leave those examples, these two examples. Of course I'm gonna delete them later, but let's use them. And this one is just a variable. I'm just gonna collapse that. Let's collapse this as well, and let's create a new method. I'm just gonna create a method called Authenticate Player. Of course, it's going to take a client ID and it's going to get in a string, which is our device ID. And let's just name this ID. Now we'll need a query. But before we do that, let's go to our database. And in this database we created before, I will create a table and I name it accounts. I name the first column ID. The second one would be device ID. Of course, we have the ability to add as many columns as we want, and we're actually going to do that later. But for now, we just need these two columns. Let's actually do elixir and gold as well. Of course, the ID is going to be an integer, and here in the auto increment part, we need to check this because it's in primary column and it is auto increment. It has to be. So in the device ID, we're just going to choose a text or varchar. Let's choose a length of 500. That's too much, but doesn't matter. And we have elixir and gold. Let's just choose a default value for them. So let's say when we start the game, we have 1,000 of both. Now let's just create the table. Now here it is, we have a table with a bunch of columns, but the most important columns that we are interested in right now is device ID. So let's go back to the server. Of course, as you can see, I have two instances of Visual Studio. The first one is the console application, and the second one is the script that I'm editing for Unity. So I'm just going to go to the server, and here in the database script, we've created a function to handle authentications. Let's create a query. I'm just going to copy that. So here we can select as many columns as we want. Of course, we can select them all by just adding a star sign here, but that is not very efficient, so we're gonna just name the columns that we want. For now, we just want ID. So let me clear that. So we're gonna select the ID from this table, which is accounts, where our device ID equals to this, and we don't need to order that by anything. And this device ID is going to be this device. And because this is in a string we're using in our MySQL statement, we need to add a single quotation around it. So we're gonna say select ID, which is basically this ID we've created, from the table accounts, which is this table we've created under our database, where the device ID equals to this device value just been passed to us. And we're just basically copy this and we say using MySQL command equals to new MySQL command, and we're gonna pass this query. This is the query, and we're gonna pass the MySQL connection. This MySQL connection is this, and it's already been written for you, so you don't need to worry about that. Of course, you can check it out if you want. And then we're gonna use a reader. Now we're saying if the reader has rows, it means that it found an account with this device ID. And here we go, we can just log in using that ID. Otherwise, let's add an else here. In this case, no account with this device ID has been found, and because of that, we're just going to generate a new account. Of course, we're gonna read the ID that has been selected. We don't need that, and this is going to be ID. Of course, we already have an ID here, that is our client ID, so this is going to be account ID. So for now, let's leave that. If we found an account, let's say we did not found an account. It means that we need to create a new account for this user. So to do that, we just simply going to create a new query. And this time, instead of select, we're going to use insert. So instead of select ID from accounts, we're saying insert into accounts. And it is going to take two parentheses. The first parenthesis is going to be the name of the values we're going to insert into the database, and we're going to say values, and the second parenthesis are going to be amount of those values in the same order. Right now we're just going to insert the device ID, and the value for it is going to be two single quotations and the variable number 0 in our string format. And here I'm just going to copy this using, and we already have a variable named command. We can just name it command2 or whatever, and this command2, we're gonna execute it, and that's it. A new value is going to be inserted into our database. We also can get an account ID, and it is going to be command2 last insert ID. Of course, this is going to be of type of long. Let's do this as long as well. So here we have handled both scenarios, which is in one of them we have an account and we get the ID of that account, and in the second scenario we do not have an account, we're just gonna create a new one and also we get the ID of those. So we can simply create another method, and we're going to say authentication response, and it's going to take a client ID and an account ID. So we're going to call this in two places. The first one is here. The parameters are going to be ID, which is this ID we are passing, that is the client ID, and the second one will be account ID. I'm just going to copy and paste this right over here. And in this method, let me fix that. We're going to use the sender and we're going to send the ID to that client. We're going to use TCP send. The first parameter of TCP send is the client ID, which we have. The second parameter is going to be a packet ID. We can create an enum here as well, but let's just pass one. And the third parameter is going to be the value we want to send is going to be account ID. You might have noticed in no scenario we're going to tell the player that he is not authenticated. So now let's go to our client and receive that ID. So we know the type of the ID we're sending is a long. It is a long value, so we need to start listening on long values that are going to be passed from the server. So here in the player script, in the start function, just before we connect to the server, I'm just gonna add a listener, and it's going to be on long received plus equal, and let's create a function for it. So we're gonna say received long, and we're gonna use this function for our listener. Of course, it will take an integer as the packet ID, and it is taking a long as value. So whenever the server sends us that account ID, we're going to receive it here. So we say switch, and we switch between the ID of that package. And in the case which that ID is 1, we'll know that it is in response to our authentication request. Let's actually use a debug.log to print that value. Now let's go to the server. Now let's go to the terminal And as you can see here on the receiver string, we're just going to say database dot authenticate player. We're gonna pass the client ID and data. Let's save this and start the server. And let's go to the client and start it as well. As you can see, we have a typo in our code. Let me stop the service. And here, instead of device ID, I've written the site ID. Let me fix that. And start one more time. Let's start the client. Another error. Apparently, these errors are not gonna stop coming. Let me stop this. So yeah, this is a very common error. Apparently, we cannot run the insert query while this data reader are still open. So for that, I will just create a boolean. And let's name it found and equal the value to false. So here, when we find a user, we're just going to set this found to true. And here, when the using statement is over, we're gonna check to see if we found the user or not. And if the found equals to false, which means we did not found a user, and we can just create a new user. Just gonna cut all of that and clear this else statement. We can also rename this command 2 to command because it's no longer a duplicate. I'm just gonna start the server, hopefully for the final time. And let's start the client as well. And apparently we have another error. Oh, this is a typo in the insert statement. I forgot to write a T. Well, this is a lot of errors. Let's just add a T here to the insert. And let's start one more time. Here we go. Client as well. And finally, we get an ID. This is number 1, which is the ID of an account that just been generated for us. Let me check the database. And as you can see, an ID has been generated. It includes a device ID, the number of elixir and gold. So let's start the client one more time, and it is going to print 1 again, and it is not going to create another account. Let me refresh this. Yes, it just used this account to log in. So just like that, we have an authentication system. Well, this video got too long. I think that's it for now.